Hi, and welcome to the Debrief, Carolina Journal's weekly recap of everything happening in public policy and politics in North Carolina's state capital. I am Donna King. I'm editor-in-chief of the Carolina Journal. Thanks for joining us this week. Make sure you like and follow this show because we bring it to you each week to bring you the latest on what's happening. And you can see all of our stories, get more information and analysis on carolinajournal.com. Okay, joining me this week, expert insight and analysis, we have Alex Baltzegar, who's been covering the legislature for Carolina Journal every day. You've read lots of his stories, I'm sure. And Mitch Kokai from the John Locke Foundation here with his expert analysis. And on the other couch, we have Teresa Opeka, who's covering the executive branch for Carolina Journal, and Brian Balfour of the John Locke Foundation. So we have a lot going on this week. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm going to kick it off with Catherine Truitt, North Carolina's superintendent of the Department of Public Instruction, was actually on Capitol Hill this week, headed out of town to testify before the Education and Workforce Committee chaired by North Carolina's own Representative Virginia Foxx. She was talking about the Office of Learning Recovery and how they've been collecting lots of data and how they're helping students recover from state-imposed shutdowns a few years ago.
This 2023 report detailed the significant strides students made in the 2021-22 school year, and it specifically highlighted that the strongest gains were made in middle school math, which is where we encourage districts to invest heavily based on data from the first report. While our state has much more to do, North Carolina was unique and intentional in its approach to recovery and acceleration. During my time in office, we have been transparent, data-driven, and research-based every step of the way. We remain committed to working alongside our school districts, providing them with access to tools, data, and one-on-one sessions so they can make informed decisions about how to best serve their students. Our schools and districts have made incredible strides in helping so many of our students get back on track to their pre-pandemic performance. And while there is more work to be done, we are on the path to recovery.
So those comments from North Carolina's superintendent of public instruction at Carolina Journal, we're going to be covering more about that, particularly now as kids are going back to school. So keep checking carolinajournal.com because we've got some stories in the works now on the teacher shortage, on new curriculum standards, lots more to come on that. So also check out our social media for links on that. So this week, though, the latest on the lawsuit trying to undo voter ID, trying to stop it from coming in just a few months before the municipal elections, plus the Department of Commerce has rescinded a hefty JDIG grant, and the latest on the state budget and lots of lawmakers jumping in some of these statewide races. Okay, Mitch, let's start with you. We're talking about voter ID. We have 90 days to go before municipal elections when we might have to have an ID. We will have to have an ID to vote.
Yeah. In fact, with this federal lawsuit, we should keep in mind that this is not going to affect the municipal elections. Okay. The State Board of Elections and all the local county boards of elections are preparing for you to have voter ID. Now, there has been some hubbub about whether you're actually going to have to use an ID, because you can say you have a reasonable impediment if you didn't have the ID, and some people have been raising a concern about that. But the plan is voter ID for municipal elections. What was interesting this week was a new development in a federal lawsuit challenging the 2018 voter ID law. This lawsuit was filed back in 2018, shortly after the law was passed, at the same time that a lawsuit was filed in state courts. And they've been two cases on similar paths in different court systems. We knew back in April that the state Supreme Court, now with its 5-2 Republican majority, came out with a ruling that said the voter ID law is fine. Forget what we said back when Democrats ran this court. Now we're saying the voter ID law is fine, which is why the State Board of Elections is proceeding with voter ID. But at the same time that happened, the folks who've been challenging voter ID in the federal courts decided, well, let's go back and see if we can try to get it knocked out through the federal court system. They asked in June to have a status conference on their voter ID lawsuit in U.S. District Court. That status conference took place this week, and there were a couple of interesting things that came out of it. One was that the magistrate judge overseeing the case at this point said, you can't open up this entire case again and go back and ask legislators for all of this information and documents and conduct interviews. That's not going to happen. And you've got a week so to the middle of next week to come back and tell me what you want to ask the State Board of Elections. And so the folks who are challenging voter ID will come back the middle of next week, say this is what we want to ask. There'll be another couple of weeks for more court filings, and about a month from now, all the court filings will be in, and then the judge will decide how the case will proceed. So none of this is going to be finalized before municipal elections, but there is still a chance that voter ID could eventually get thrown out by the federal courts before the big 2024 elections. We already know that Judge Loretta Biggs, who's the one who has been overseeing it, is no fan of voter ID. She put in an injunction a couple of years ago against voter ID. The Fourth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals came back and threw out her injunction, but by that point, the state court case was the one that was blocking voter ID. Now the state courts have cleared all obstacles for voter ID, but this federal case is still lingering out there. So people should keep that in mind as they're preparing for the future.
Sure, sure. What are you hearing around the General Assembly? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, obviously our state lawmakers like voter ID. They've tried to get voter ID passed. They put a constitutional amendment on the ballot. I think that was 2018,
right.
And voters supported it. So I think the lawmakers are really excited that there's a chance this finally goes into effect. It's supposed to go into effect, but I think a lot of them are just kind of waiting to see what happens.
Right, right. It's definitely been litigated through the court system, even though majority of North Carolinians approve it.
Right, and then that happens a lot. I mean, they pass a law, and then obviously, it has to jump through a bunch of judicial hurdles.
Sure.
So yeah, I'd be curious to see what happens.
Great. Well, Teresa, where is the State Board of Elections on this? This is something that we had Zach Rounceville cover in Charlotte, and there's different kinds of IDs that they're talking about. What have you heard?
Yeah. So what his story had about the IDs is basically they passed. Like, we're going to have to show them this fall in the elections. You could use a student ID, a workplace ID.
Right.
But there's also what Zach wrote on about a little unknown page on there. If you don't have an ID, what are the reasons why?
Okay.
I didn't know that I needed an ID.
Sure.
That's been a big controversial point going around social media. There's also, I didn't have childcare, I have work responsibilities. You kind of think, well, you need an ID.
Right.
Like, how can you use those excuses? Like, of course, if you are unable, you don't have transportation, maybe you are disabled, of course, that's unacceptable. But yeah, that's what Zach was writing on, and it's actually very interesting. I think there's a lot more to come with that.
Absolutely, yes. You can see that story on carolinajournal.com, which has some details on what the State Board of Elections is wrestling with right now for implementation. Brian, tell me what your thoughts are. I know y'all have done a lot of research on this, its popularity, and how to get it from the ballot to putting it in use.
Yeah, well, I mean, speaking of its popularity, I mean, I've been following our polling back to the Civitas days for 15, 16 years. And if there's one thing that consistently polls, even across party lines and through independents and everything, that consistently polls better than just about any other issue they poll is voter ID. I mean, it's just a common sense measure. I moved down here from Michigan about 16 years ago. And first time I went to vote, I started reaching for the ID.
Right.
It was just natural. So, North Carolina has so many people immigrating from other states, I mean, that have voter ID. It's just a natural, and I think that's part of why there's so much support for it, because people are just so used to it, coming from other states. And so it's just really something that's a common sense measure that's widely supported amongst people across the state and across party lines.
Sure, interesting. We're going to be following more on that. Teresa, I'm going to actually come right back to you. We've been talking a lot about incentive grants at Carolina Journal and, of course, at the John Locke Foundation. This week, Allstate got some bad news from JDIG.
Yeah, so they're the latest company to have their JDIG grant fall through for not holding up their end of the bargain. They were supposed to create over 2,200 jobs by 2020 as a result of a grant, the JDIG grant of a little over $17 million. Wow. So I did talk to somebody at Department of Commerce yesterday. They said they did give them a grace period of a year because of COVID, maybe give it up to 2021. However, they still didn't create the jobs. So, what they said before is, well, COVID is a reason. I think a lot of these companies, to be fair, a lot of people are now working from home, remote work is the reason being. So they fell through on that. But Department of Commerce said, we didn't invest any money, they didn't get any money, so we're a little more lenient. But still, you have an agreement, fulfill those jobs.
Sure.
And it's been an ongoing problem with JDIG. It's had a bad track record. We have seen everything: Sonic Automotive, Advanced Auto, Conduent. There was a bunch. Microsoft is another. They just could not produce the jobs, hold up their end of the bargain as far as this agreement. And what's funny is we have, soon we're going to have no corporate income tax in the state. And Governor Cooper is always like, you know, you don't need to reduce that. Companies are coming here. There's plenty of companies coming here. Well, by the same token, you're offering all these JDIG grants, and companies can't fulfill their end of the bargain to create jobs. So it's like the opposite argument. So it's got a troubled past. Other notable companies who are in progress right now who have this is Apple and also VinFast, the troubled Vietnamese EV automaker, who is going to be breaking ground tomorrow, Friday, in Chatham County for their new plant. So it's not a great track record, and we'll have to see where this goes.
Sure. So as, Brian, for you, as our corporate tax comes down, does that mean that we're, you know, it's becoming not something we need, these taxpayer-paid incentives?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to think that's one of the arguments for eliminating the corporate income tax, because then it eliminates the, you know, the felt need, the desire by politicians to grant these specific tax breaks to corporations. And kind of to Teresa's point about Governor Cooper, you know, Governor Cooper campaigned and continues to talk over the last several years about how he's against corporate tax giveaways when it's reducing the corporate tax for all businesses, but then he goes and he's always first to be in line to do the ribbon cutting ceremony and put out the press releases granting these targeted tax credits to specific. So he's kind of talking out both sides of his mouth.
But it is, I mean, I've heard this argument from commerce secretaries and the governor that this is walking around money. This is what they can offer companies to try and build jobs and create industry here. Do you think that we might be getting to the point where, you know, it's you know, if this is an example of that they're not coming to fruition, is it really worth doing? Yeah,
I'm hoping so, but also seeing some troubling signs of late over the last couple of years. I mean, these deals at Apple and VinFast, I mean, we're talking about $1 billion possibly in tax breaks for these corporations over the course of 30 plus years in these cases. I mean, one thing that's certain about the economy is the uncertainty. We don't know what the economy is going to look like. You know, things happen. There's a lot of uncertainty, and so it's absolutely absurd to tie North Carolina taxpayers to these companies for the next 20, 30 plus years. I mean, we do not know what the economy is going to look like 3 decades from now. I mean, think about what the economy was like 30 years ago compared to what it is today. I mean, why in the world are we committing North Carolina taxpayers to these companies for, you know, 20, 30 plus years?
Sure. So for Mitch, this thing with Allstate, does this indicate a program that actually works because they were able to get the money back?
There is a positive sign about this program. The John Locke Foundation has always been against any type of targeted tax incentives and should be, because it doesn't make sense. Brian has alluded to this, the fact that you're basically going to be better off if you just have lower across the board tax rates, less regulatory burden, spend the government money only on the core needs. That's going to be the type of thing that brings in businesses, not just the ones you know about, the ones that have a big name, but the businesses we don't even know about. That's just a dream in some entrepreneur's mind right now. They're going to want to come here because of those other conditions, not because of a tax break. But as long as North Carolina is going to continue to be in this game, and they should get out of the game, but as long as they're going to be in the game, some things about JDIG are actually positive. One, we didn't cut Allstate a check. We basically said, create the jobs and you get this payroll tax break. They never created jobs, so they never got the break. That's a plus. Also, it was monitored. Most of us, when we hear about the incentives deals, we think, okay, they gave them the money, it's gone. It's over. But no, actually there is a process. They had to fill out paperwork. They had to say they created the jobs. They never did, so they never got the money. That's a positive, although there are some transaction costs with it. And then the other thing that's a positive, and I think is the silver lining about this announcement this week, is once it was clear it failed, it ended. I mean, we know plenty of government programs where it fails over and over and over again, and so you just give it more money. You give them more money, give them more time, and they could have done that with Allstate. They could have said, well, you created a couple hundred jobs, so we'll give you a partial refund, or we'll extend it out 4 or 5 more years because of COVID. You know, it's going to take you longer. No, they basically said, hey, it didn't work. You're not going to get the break. Allstate agreed. They said, we're not going to create the jobs. They sent a letter saying, we only have 200 people at this place where we were going to have 2,200. let's just give it up, which also proves another fact, and that is an insurance giant like Allstate never needed this money. They basically said, we'll take your hand out, but when the economic conditions changed, they said, you know, it's not worth it, the hassle anymore, take your grant, we're going to be in business regardless. And so it's a sign that, like many of the other incentives, it's basically just a way for politicians to say they helped contribute to bringing a company here. The company didn't need the money. They were just happy to take the handout if it was going to be given to them.
Sure, interesting. So we're talking about taxes, incentives, and all that. I'm hoping you have some sort of inside track on what's happening with the negotiations and the budget, because taxes are going to be a part of it.
Right. So state lawmakers are at an impasse. The House and Senate chambers are at odds.
Sure.
I was talking with a couple of different lawmakers from different sides of the two chambers. I was talking with Senator Brent Jackson, sent me
Right.
some context there, because there's been this narrative that the Democrats are starting to put on the Republicans about them just being not able to govern,
Sure.
essentially. And the two chambers obviously are always at odds, the House and Senate, and so
Right.
Jackson sent me a statement about that, and Jason saying, I was texting with him, and he said that this is a very common thing for the House and Senate to have different priorities,
Sure.
regardless of party. But anyways, all that's to say they are at an impasse
Yeah.
with budget stuff. So the Senate
Right.
has their priorities, one of which is NCInnovation,
Okay.
which is this $1.425 billion project, which I think Brian
Yeah.
may touch on this a little bit later.
Sure.
But that's a big priority of the Senate. They also want to get the personal income tax down
Right.
to 2.49%, and they want to accelerate cuts that had already been planned. They
Okay.
want to speed them up. The House is a little bit more concerned about doing it too quickly.
Okay.
And there is some economic uncertainty, and so that's their side of the argument, and they would like to install triggers on these taxes.
Okay.
So they still want the tax breaks, but they would like to have some sort of safeguard so that the tax breaks don't necessarily go into effect if we have some sort of revenue downturn.
Sure.
And then there's a number of different priorities. I could go on for a
Yeah,
while. But
I'll bet so. All right, we're looking forward to seeing what you write about it.
It's important to note quickly, if they don't do anything, we already have tax cuts that are built in
Sure.
to the budget that was signed into law by Governor Cooper. The rate goes down to 3.99% in a matter of years. The Senate just wants to speed that up.
Okay.
And both sides have agreed in their initial budget plans that the rate that was supposed to fall to 4.6% next year would fall to 4.5%. But
Okay.
then the difference is what happens after that. The House didn't put anything beyond cutting that 4.6 to 4.5, and the Senate went way deeper to go to that 2.49.
All right, lots unfolding in the next few months. What are you thinking, mid-August? Maybe?
So
Late August?
mid-August is like probably best case scenario.
Okay.
I think they're going to be back early-ish August to start getting the ball rolling again
Okay,
on
sure.
negotiations. And so if they can come to an agreement in 2 weeks, then yeah, maybe mid-August. But
All right.
I'm a little skeptical.
Good. All right. I'm looking forward to seeing what you have to say about that. Let's actually talk about NCInnovation. You just mentioned it. This is something you've been really focused on. You've been publishing a series of research articles about other programs in other states like NCInnovation, which is being proposed. Bring us up to date. What is NCInnovation? Why is it, in your view, controversial?
Yeah, so just by way of a little bit of background, NCInnovation is a recently formed nonprofit organization.
Okay.
It was created just a few years ago in 2020. And their stated intent or mission is to try to coordinate with university campuses and take their kind of the innovations and research that they're doing on those campuses and take them to market, kind of commercialize them, if they will, you know, through largely like startup companies. To try to begin selling these products on the market. And so what NCInnovation is they'll take funding to try to help. And part of what they would do is try to invest in some of these small startup businesses and kind of pump them with some capital to get them off the ground and running. And so far NCInnovation, of course, it's new. It's been pretty quiet so far. They claim on their website that they've raised $23 million in private funds.
Okay.
It's not quite clear if those are actual funds on hand or if those are like promised.
Pledged money.
Pledged money,
Yeah.
exactly right. Indeed, I looked at their 2022 tax returns and they have less than $5 million in assets listed on that. So it's already a little bit unclear.
Sure. Well, what are they
their
asking
finances.
taxpayers to do?
And so, so what they're asking taxpayers is they actually, in their literature, they we're talking about $250 million a year
Okay.
over 10 years for a total of $2.5 billion.
Okay.
Governor Cooper's budget and the House budget wanted to give them a little more than a tenth of that,
Sure.
$50 million for each budget. And then the Senate came along and they said, why don't we just give you $1.4 billion?
Wow.
Kind of with the notion, I think, is this is like a one-time appropriation, like here's this huge endowment, and you can
Yeah, don't
live
come
off
back,
that.
yeah.
Don't come back anymore. You guys can be self-sustaining after that.
Okay.
So that's obviously a heavy ask for taxpayers. And indeed, it would be, according to some research I did, the largest state appropriation to a non-state entity
Really?
in the budget's history. So it's really a big ask, especially for such a new company, or I'm sorry, a new organization.
Sure.
And we've obviously have several issues with that at the Locke Foundation. Number one, first and foremost, above all else, is just another one of these kind of crony, capitalist corporate welfare programs where
Okay.
taxpayer dollars are being used to give to select companies. And
Right.
we're obviously completely against that, have always been against that.
Sure.
There's also troubling things that we've noticed about the Senate budget and how it creates or alters like the management, the organization itself, and also issues with transparency. For example, according to the Senate budget language, NCInnovation would be exempt from public disclosure, public meetings laws and public records request laws. So there'd be an extreme lack of transparency about what they're doing. And again, I remind you, they're looking at sitting on $1.4 billion of taxpayer dollars, and they're going to be doing all this in secret.
Sure.
According to the Senate budget plan. So that's really concerning. And then also one other thing about, I mentioned the organization, the board of directors, again, the Senate language would prohibit any state employees from being on the board of directors at NCInnovation,
Okay.
which means no university heads, presidents or anything, which a few of them are currently on the board.
So they're being removed from the board.
So they would be removed and prohibited from being on the board, which kind of doesn't make sense given how NCInnovation talks a lot about coordinating with universities,
Sure.
in terms of the research and bringing it to market. So there's a lot of troubling things to see when you start
Sure.
peering under the hood of NCInnovation.
It's because the idea is laudable. I mean, the idea of investing in North Carolina's universities who maybe don't get enough attention for their research accomplishments, ECU, Western Carolina, some of these. Is this a business you think government should be in, Mitch?
Definitely not in the way that this is spelled out.
Okay.
Certainly there could be investment in the universities for their research. There
Sure.
is. That is something that you could fund, the research for the universities. But then the idea of taking that research and translating it into business, which is a great goal, but that's something that should be done by people in business, risking their own money, risking their investors' money, not risking taxpayers' money.
Sure.
I mean, one plus, it's not a great plus, but one plus about this whole thing is that we probably wouldn't have paid a whole lot of attention to it if the money had stayed at about the $50 million that Governor Cooper and the House were talking about. Right. This really only started to attract attention when the Senate jumped the shark and said, no, let's give them $1.4 billion, right. Which when you have a general fund budget that is in the neighborhood of $30 billion, you're talking about a huge chunk that would be for this, as Brian talked about, unaccountable group that basically will be using taxpayers' money with no open meetings, public records, transparency involved.
Sure.
That has to raise concerns for anyone who wants to have a government that's doing only core functions.
Absolutely. Now, they have a lot of firepower. This NCInnovation group has some serious firepower. Big bank and retired bank presidents and CEOs, but also a lot of lobbyists.
That's right. They've got 9 lobbyists, which
Okay.
is a pretty substantial number. Like if you see that, something's happening there.
Sure.
So yeah, they've got 9 registered lobbyists, and they've done a really good job with sort of setting the Overton window on this picture, because
Okay.
what the Senate did was give them the bare minimum that they could do if they set it up as an endowment.
Okay.
But of course, I think NCInnovation sort of set that as the minimum, and so I think they were asking for $2.5 billion,
Sure.
either all at once or over the 10-year period or whatever. So
Very interesting.
yeah, so they do have a lot of firepower. I know that a lot of the board members have a lot of long-standing relationships with lawmakers, and so there are a lot of ties there.
Sure.
But yeah,
It seems like when I look at this list of names, it seems like they could come up with some of that money themselves. But we'll see. I don't know. Have other states tried to do this?
Oh yeah. I mean, this is not uncommon. Several other states have been engaged in these types of programs for several years, and NCInnovation actually hails some of them. I think about a half dozen or so they cite specifically, which is interesting because I started doing a little bit of digging on some of these other programs, and one state that they mention, NCInnovation mentions, is the state of Texas and a program that they had, and I wrote about this recently, that program actually had to be shuttered after 10 years, and it was described by the Texas media as scandal-plagued because, surprise, surprise, a lot of this money was going to friends and family members of people on the board of this Texas organization, or big donors to the governor at that time, which is, that type of program kind of invites that kind of corruption. Another program they talked about was this Georgia Research Alliance, which is a little more recently founded, but does have a track record, and I found that an audit done in, I think it was 2012, after the organization was around for about a decade, talking about lack of transparency. This audit couldn't really find records on what kind of jobs were created or which, how successful these businesses were. They were able to track down, though, I think there was about 120 businesses to that point in the first 10 years that had received money through this program. Half of them were no longer even doing business in the state of Georgia. Wow. So just like JDIG, this Georgia program, a very poor track record, and their state allotments from the state government were far, far smaller, even on a far smaller scale than anything NCInnovation is looking for at this point. And these, the Texas and Georgia and some of these others, I mean, these programs were hailed as success stories and examples by NCInnovation, like in their kind of marketing pitch, if you will. Like, hey, look at what these other states are doing. What they're doing is great. We can have that here in North Carolina as well. But when you start digging into those other programs, you're like, well, they're not exactly a great shining examples of what you want to bring to North Carolina.
Very interesting. Well, I mean, they bring up a valid point. So what's happening in a lot of these places is there's some research that's being done. Out-of-state companies come down. Taxpayer pays for the research in the first place because universities and out-of-state groups come, snap up the technology, and make it elsewhere. And they also say they've built in some guidelines that the board members and those involved can't invest directly in these companies. There's got to be some solution that doesn't involve taxpayers coming up with, $1.4 billion, right?
Yeah, and like I wrote, I mean, not every perceived problem requires a government solution.
Right.
I mean, it's maybe there's something that can be improved in the state's regulatory climate or tax climate, continue to make improvements to the tax code. And so it's just going to invite corruption, and it has a poor track record elsewhere. It has a poor track record when we look at what North Carolina's been doing already with JDIG and other programs. So I think it's just a raw deal for North Carolina taxpayers.
All right, we're going to be following that really closely, yeah.
If the research is here, but the business is going elsewhere, the problem is probably dealing with the business climate and something to do with the regulations or the taxes. That's where you make the change, not by giving $1.4 billion to this group.
Very interesting. All right, yeah, this is an ongoing issue. We're certainly going to be watching this as the budget negotiations unfold, which Alex has been covering for us. Been really quiet there. The General Assembly while all this happens behind closed doors, so a lot of folks have been jumping in these statewide races. I think it's an indication they think their home seat is safe.
We'll see what happens. There's going to be a lot that goes on with redistricting once we finish up with budget negotiations and pass budget and all that. So we'll see what happens there. But yes, there are a lot of current and former state lawmakers that are looking at these statewide races. A lot of them have already jumped in. I'll just start at the top. The governor's race, Josh Stein, who's a former state senator, obviously he's been the attorney general for a little while now, is probably going to be the Democratic nominee, pending Mike Morgan or one of these other people jumping in and coming from behind. But he's already raised a lot of money, so he'll likely be the Democratic nominee. On the Republican side, we've got Dale Falwell, who's currently our state treasurer, but he's also a former state lawmaker too. And then we've got Andy Wells, who just jumped in either early this week or last week to the governor's race. He's a former state senator who had run for lieutenant governor back in the, I think the 2020 cycle originally. And he placed second, but coming in pretty far behind Mark Robinson, who kind of took North Carolina by storm in that race.
Yeah, definitely.
And who is also probably the favorite on the Republican side for the governor's race. So those two will be running against each other again.
Sure.
And then we've got the lieutenant governor's race.
Uh-huh.
That one, there are a lot of state lawmakers in. I think I've got 5. I think I wrote some of them down. Rachel Hunt is probably the favorite now on the Democratic side, mainly because of how much money she raised. I think she raised like $500,000.
Wow.
And for being this far out in a lieutenant governor's race, that's pretty substantial.
That is.
Shows the level of institutional support she has. So if I had to guess, she'll probably be the Democratic nominee, but there's still some time there. I know former state senator Ben Clark is also in that race. He's also a pretty strong contender, I would say. I'm trying to think if there's anyone. Oh, Raymond Smith, he's a former representative in the state house. He's also in that race on the Democratic side. And then on the Republican side, there's a whole laundry list of people in it, but I think there's only 2 state lawmakers. One is Jeffrey Elmore, who's currently in the House. He's a senior education chair.
Sure, teacher.
He's a teacher. He's been doing education policy a long time. And then former Senator Deanna Ballard, who got drawn into a primary with one of her colleagues last time through redistricting, and she lost that race by a hair-thin margin.
Right.
But she declared, I think last week, did you? I think
Early
Teresa,
this week.
you might have written
Yeah,
something
actually,
on
tell
that.
us a little bit about that. You wrote that because I know that double bunking with highs was real challenge for lawmakers this past election.
Yeah, it was. I'll do the redistricting of the maps, and she was, Deanna Bellards, very popular. They're both very popular, so that was a hard race, hard and lost race, but she's very popular, up and coming in her background and from her previous background, and she also had a background in education, fighting for parents' rights and for mask mandates to be done away with, school shutdowns to be done away with. As she says on her website, she went toe-to-toe with Governor Cooper and the DHHS.
Right.
So she looks pretty favorable.
Interesting.
I think.
All right. We'll be watching that really closely. You also cover Treasurer Falwell, and as part of your beat, but he's got his eye on the governor's race.
Yeah, he does. He does. But I think in a different year where there wouldn't be a Mark Robinson, he might be one of the top candidates. But it's
a tough race.
It's a tough race. It really is.
It is.
And what they say about charisma, just like they talk about Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump. They're saying Ron DeSantis doesn't have the charisma. Right. And same thing with Mark Robinson.
Yeah, it's hard to out-stump him for sure.
Exactly.
What are your thoughts on this, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, the governor's race certainly is beginning to crowd up. I mean, I followed just from personal experience as a fiscal policy person, I'm much more familiar with Dale Falwell's track record, and he's done an outstanding job as state treasurer. I can certainly attest to that. But I mean, beyond that, I don't really want to jump into all these political horse races.
Yeah, of course, it is interesting, Mitch. It seems like the General Assembly becomes sort of a training ground for these statewide races.
It really does, and one of the reasons why we're seeing so many legislators get involved is that we're seeing the dominoes fall for various positions becoming open.
Right.
Governor Roy Cooper is term limited, so the governor's race is open. So that has drawn in the treasurer and the lieutenant governor and the attorney general, which means all of their races are open.
Right.
So people want to run for those seats. Plus, we have a labor commissioner who has served only one term who's not running for re-election, and that has drawn some people in, including legislators like John Hardister.
Sure.
So when you have all of these various statewide council of state races opening up more than normal, that's really going to bring legislators in, especially for the seats beyond governor and lieutenant governor.
Right.
If you have worked in an area in the legislature where you worked a lot on commerce or labor issues, or you worked on education issues, that might make you a prime candidate to run for the Council of State seat that deals with those same issues.
Of course, very interesting. Before we head out, I want to show you this tweet of the week. It's from Andy Jackson, also at the John Locke Foundation. This is the increase in new registrations. It's very interesting. Voter registrations come. Look at the growth there in unaffiliated registrations. I think North Carolina is moving more and more to that. Some of that is just, younger folks who are now of voting age are tending to register unaffiliated. Now, the L and the G, if you're not familiar, that's Libertarian and the Green Party. Green Party added to the ballot last year. I'm really impressed with the number of folks who are starting to register unaffiliated. Do you think that that's a generational thing? What do you think?
Well, in North Carolina, it's almost just structural.
Okay.
I think we do see this trend across the country in some ways about people wanting to be less partisan and
Sure.
not necessarily label themselves. But in North Carolina, because we have what's called an open primary,
Right.
There's no incentive for you to be a member of either party. Actually, your best incentive is it's actually a semi-open primary. So
Right.
a Republican can't vote in a Democratic primary,
Okay.
and vice versa.
You just pick
But
up
if you're
one, yeah.
unaffiliated, you can vote in either primary. So maybe there's not much happening in the Republican primary this year, and you want to jump into the Democratic primary.
Right.
You can't do that as a registered Republican.
Sure.
So you got to be unaffiliated. So I actually think it's more structural in our state. Which is interesting, and it
ideological.
goes back to some old legislative decisions about opening up the primaries.
Very
Yeah, other
interesting.
states don't have that. Like I come from Pennsylvania, we could not. You were strictly Democrat
Right.
or Republican. Independents, tough
Sure,
luck.
sure. And
You
as
couldn't do it.
we mentioned on the last show, if folks vote in one for the primary, they tend to stick with it for the general. So that's something to be watching really closely, particularly as we head into 2024. Thanks for joining us here on The Debrief. Make sure you check out carolinajournal.com for all of our news coverage on state government politics and public policy.